Welcome to the Columbus Metropolitan Club. From its beginning, CMC has welcomed everyone. I'm Kelly Atkinson, the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Director and Columbus Office Administrator at Barnes & Thornburg and the Chair of CMC's Board of Trustees. So today's forum is sponsored by Cover My Meds, Barnes & Thornburg, Encova, and Crane Group, with support from WBNS 10 TV. Today's live stream is presented by the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. Let's thank all of those supporting today's program. All right. Experts say diversity is the presence of differences that may include race, gender, religion, sexual orientation, ethnicity, nationality, socioeconomic status, language, disability, age, religious commitment, and political perspective, and I'd argue even more than that. Today's expert panelists will explore what diversity plus equity and inclusion means for organizations and companies that are interested in understanding the true meaning and value of DEI and doing the right thing. On behalf of today's sponsor, please welcome Raymond Weaver, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Lead with Cover My Meds, to introduce today's panel. And Raymond, the podium is yours.
Hello and good afternoon. It's truly evident that organizations today are focusing on expanding multicultural, diverse, and even global top-tier talent. And successful organizations prioritize DEI that welcomes people from all backgrounds with creating a sense of belonging. It can even maximize your potential, your perspective, access, and opportunities. It not only creates a hyper-engaged workforce, but it's fundamental to every organization's success. Now more than ever, we have the opportunity to create a more inclusive culture and ecosystem with a virtual experience. And at Cover My Meds, we want everyone to choose to come to our organization because we will create a system that allows them to feel safe, supported, and most importantly, respected. By focusing on culture, talent, and marketplace, we hope ensure that every voice is heard and we remain the place where anyone can see themselves here and be successful. Diversity, equity, and inclusion work is doing the right thing. And today we'll hear a few different perspectives about how we can continue to do the right thing as organizations, as a community, and as individuals. Now, let's welcome today's speakers. Today we have Angela Bretz, Senior Vice President and Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer with Nationwide. Tanny Crane, President and CEO of Crane Group. Dr. Jona Hilario, Statewide Co-Director for OPAWL, Building AAPI Feminist Leadership. Anthony Wilson, Chief Diversity Officer for the Columbus Metropolitan Library. And our host, Rolf Smithers Jr., Associate Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and Community Relations for Encova Insurance. You can learn more about today's speakers in your forum flyer. Rolf, we look forward to today's conversation. Thank you.
Thanks, Raymond. Well, before we begin, I want to just give you a little more context about what we hope to accomplish today. First of all, we have some wonderful leaders here, and we're going to talk about what works, what doesn't work, the business case, and insights on how to execute a DE&I strategy. So we're really excited about that. And we have a real diverse group within our group here. We have corporate, nonprofit, community, and a CEO. So we're going to give you a really wide perspective on this issue. But one thing I want to warn you, got to warn you about this. We have a lot of good stuff to talk about. And there is a strong possibility that we won't get to it all. In fact, I know that we won't. And we're going to leave you wanting for more. So if this conversation continues out in the parking lot or out in the community, then we've done our job today. Okay? Fantastic. Okay, so we are going to we have a lot of good questions here, and I actually want to start with Tanny. And Tanny, I wanted to just ask if you could just speak to there's a business case for DE&I, and for those that may not be as close to this work, I just wondered if you could speak to the business case.
Well, thanks, Ralph. And I could speak for the whole entire time on this, but you know, often we talk about the financial, you know, as a business person, we look at what's the financial impact. And there's lots of studies that talk about the positive impact of DEI and of equity. And just two recent statistics that I've heard, I'll share with you, but there's far greater importance. But so all of us are focused on innovation. And there's now data to show that innovation-based revenues are 19% higher in those companies where management teams are overrepresented in DEI and equity than those that are underrepresented. 19% difference. And then a really great piece of data that is very relevant to conversations we've been having over the past couple of weeks with the Intel announcement that Ralph and I found interesting was that if we had racial equity in wages and employment, we would have an Intel-sized opportunity every year. We would see a $10 billion improvement in GDP annually if we had that racial equity. That's pretty startling. But I say it goes way beyond that. What we found in our own organization is with equity, when we have diversity in our employment that we do, we have richer conversations. We have better decision-making, and we have stronger teams. And we see the difference in employee engagement. But what we've recognized, though, Ralph, is that it can't just be that I believe in it. It has to be really ingrained and immersed throughout the organization. And associates have to be involved. And we've involved our associates at every level, from education to our corporate commitment to our community. It takes everyone. And it's not just the hiring. We say, okay, let's hire. It's the pipeline, it's recruiting. But once they're on board, if they don't feel included, if our associates do not feel included, they are not going to stay with our company. So it's much deeper than that, and it's sustainable. It has to be sustainable.
Outstanding. And speaking of that, Angela, can you share some DE&I strategies or tactics that have worked well for you at Nationwide?
Sure, I'd be happy to, Ralph. I would say a tactic from the start is to recognize that DE&I is absolutely a journey. It's not something that will happen overnight. It's also not anything that you should start and continue. It should be a continuum. It should be woven into the fabric of who your organization is. At Nationwide, we say that DE&I is in our DNA because from our founding, we were founded to solve a diverse insurance need for farmers. And so from our founding, we've had diversity in our history. In addition to that, I would say it's important to be intentional and purposeful on your DE&I journey and make sure that you ground your DE&I work into your strategic priorities, whatever those are. Each organization is a little different on where they are currently and where they want to go, but make sure the work that you are doing is grounded in your DE&I strategic priorities. For us at Nationwide, we have 3 DEI strategic priorities, and it's the workforce. And in the workforce, that means representation inside of Nationwide that is reflective of America's diversity. It also includes the workplace, and that is, as Tanny just mentioned, it's that continual advancement of an inclusive culture. We want our associates to see themselves at all levels of the organization and come to work each day as their authentic self and thrive. And so we need to be purposeful and intentional about continuing to advance our inclusive culture. And then lastly, DE&I goes beyond, and Tanny mentioned this, it goes beyond the organization. You have to have a presence in the marketplace, in the communities where we all live, work, and serve. And so that's the third pillar of our strategic priorities, is that marketplace, that brand and reputation and presence in the community.
That sounds pretty impressive. Really good business case, really good engagement and opportunities for companies. It must be real easy, huh?
Not so much.
Probably not. So Anthony, what are some of the major challenges confronted by chief diversity officers in today's environment?
Thanks, Ralph. I would say one of the critical challenges is making DEI a high business priority. And the part of that challenge is getting there. How do we get there? And so one of the things you have to do is you have to have your top executives, they have to position themselves to be the champions of DEI. It can't just be the CDO. It has to be the top level executives, because everybody expects the CDO or the VP of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to champion the cause, but it has to be everyone at the top. The second thing is you have to center DEI in your business strategy, your vision, your purpose. And then the third part is you have to hold department leaders and division leaders accountable for driving DEI outcomes. And what we have to do with that is we have to, one, help identify KPIs or key performance indicators, and then give those leaders the resources that they need to achieve those outcomes. And then I would say one more challenge, especially in today's environment, is burnout. Because chief diversity officers, people who are leading the diversity efforts, they wear a lot of hats. And it's a rewarding job, but it can be lonely. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So, Jona, we didn't want to leave you out because she has an important voice. A lot of times DE&I is kind of thought of as a kind of a black and white issue, but it's certainly more than that. What would you want a chief diversity officer to know about the Asian American Pacific Islander community?
Thank you, Ralph, for bringing that up. So that was really what I wanted to talk about here today. So I want everybody to come out here realizing that AAPIs are the fastest growing racial demographic in the state. So Asian Americans statewide grew by 68.3% from 2010 to 2020. And Pacific Islanders grew by 44%. In Columbus alone, AAPI residents increased by 76%. And in Central Ohio, we have the highest number of Bhutanese Nepali folks outside of Asia. So we all have to understand that the demographic of our state and our city is changing. The second thing that I want everybody to realize is AAPIs are not a monolith. So again, AAPIs are not a monolith. When we talk about AAPIs, we are talking about people who come from very diverse backgrounds, very diverse countries, ethnicities, 150 languages, and we're all kind of lumped into this one category, right? And some of us may have been in this country for 5 or 6 generations, some just recently immigrated, and then of those immigrants, you have people who come here to be reunited with their families. You have people like me who came here for job and educational opportunities, and then you have people who came here to escape war, oppression, natural disasters. So just from those perspectives, you could think about how diverse this population is. And the thing is, though, if you say AAPI to most people, you'd have a very specific person in mind. And this is probably due to Hollywood or any other ideas that we have as a culture. It would usually be somebody who's primarily East Asian, maybe, good in math or science, plays the violin, probably relatively wealthy. But if you disaggregate the data, you come up with a very different picture of our population. So actually today is AAPI Women's Equal Pay Day. So I want to look through that lens today. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with the framing of how we talk about pay gaps with each dollar that a white man makes in America. For example, right now, women on average make 83 cents for each dollar that a white man makes. For AAPIs, that number is 85 cents. So that may seem like not a bad deal, right? However, if you break it down, there are some ethnicities within the AAPI umbrella who make 50 cents for every dollar a white man makes. For example, Nepalese make 50 cents, Burmese 52 cents, and Samoans make on average 62 cents. So what I really want everybody to know is that this aggregated data when it comes to AAPI is very, very important.
Thanks, Jona. So I hope you all brought your calculators, because we've been throwing a lot of numbers and a lot of data out to really show that there is really truly something to this. I'm going to ask Tanny another question. If you could, what's the business community in Central Ohio doing about this?
I'm glad you asked that question, Ralph.
You didn't know in advance, did you?
No, never. Well, I can tell you what the Columbus Partnership, and Kenny McDonald is here, and really proud that Kenny has very much been leading this charge with the input of around 80 members or so. And it's really been for almost 2 years. You know, I guess we could mark the time of George Floyd's murder and saying, what are we as a community going to do about this? And we had the opportunity, well, it was during the pandemic, but we had the opportunity for the entire summer to come together quite often virtually and be educated. And we had the opportunity through working with Harvard and the Harvard law professor, Jonathan Livingston, who is also the author of a fantastic book, if you haven't read it, called The Conversation. And one thing he taught us was this acronym PRESS. And it really talks about, first you have to understand the challenge and the issue of systemic racism before you can do anything. And a lot of business people want to jump in and try to solve. And first we have to be educated, understand what we can do, develop empathy around it, and then develop a strategy and what are we going to sacrifice. So after that, now we go into action. And you know, like the One Columbus, we want to be the most prosperous region in the country, of course. And in the past 10 years, we have, you know, been up there in terms of our GDP and our job growth. But what we haven't been able to do, and I guess misery loves company, the top 200 cities in the nation haven't either, is reduce the disparity. Not one of 200 cities, top 200 cities in the country have been able to manage to do that. So you measure what matters, and Anthony talked about KPIs. We have decided, stacking hands as a business community, that we have to put metrics behind it. And so we're really working hard, and we're evolving this process now that through working with Brookings Institute and others, we realize that, and through their evidence, that if we can really increase the talent and increase the number of people of color, students of color going to college or getting credentialed, and then increase quality jobs, and then provide wealth, that will reduce or eliminate our equity gap, and that's our commitment by 2030. So what does that mean for the business community? What can we do? You know, in terms of developing the talent, an example is Columbus Promise, which is a wonderful opportunity that the city and the community is really, what we're doing a 3-year project to really encourage and help students in Columbus City schools get to Columbus State and provide the scholarship, full scholarship for Columbus State. What can the business community do? We can provide internships. We can help develop that talent. We can support them. We can mentor them. And then we can in turn provide quality jobs. And then we go back to our own practices in our companies of everything that Angela is saying in terms of we can develop our own metrics of increasing diversity at all levels, really changing that power structure. And then in terms of creating wealth, our supplier diversity, what are we doing to really work with minority suppliers, increasing their opportunity for further employment and creating their wealth? So those are, the business community has really stacked hands, but we're evolving, we're moving, we're leaning into this, but it's a long process. It's not a project, and this has to be sustainable.
Fantastic.
Tanny, if I could add
Sure.
a comment. You mentioned, you know, representation, and for me, I am a career nationwider, and I will tell you what has kept me a career nationwider is that representation that you have heard several of us talk about. And even over 30 years ago, when I started my nationwide career, and our representation then, I won't kid you, does not look like it does today, but even then, I could see myself at all levels of the organization. So for me, at a very young age, I knew if I wanted to have a career at nationwide, I could because I saw myself. And I just want to emphasize that because I think it's so critically important. And now that I'm head of talent acquisition for Nationwide, as I'm out talking to recruits on college campuses, you know, that's one of the questions we get. They want to see themselves within the organization, and that's just a critical element that all organizations have to consider, and I just wanted to chime in there.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate that. And speaking of that, Angela, I know that you've had an interesting career path to get to where you are right now. You haven't always, in your whole 30 years, done this. I know you've done other things. But in your estimation, what are the skills required for today's chief diversity officers?
So, wow, it's wide-ranging. I will start in saying that, and as Ralph mentioned, my background is I've not been in diversity, equity, and inclusion or talent acquisition for 30 years. I spent most of my career on the business side, and I will tell you that that analytical mindset is important for a chief diversity officer. You need structure and systems and process, and you also need to be able to measure and monitor. We've heard that on the panel this morning, what you're expecting to see. And if you're not getting the desired results from whatever the system and structures you have in place, you have to be willing to pivot and pivot pretty quickly to make that change. And so I think that analytical mindset is critical for a CDO, but probably most importantly, I would say it's empathy and compassion. You have to be able to walk in other shoes that are different from yours without judgment. It is a no judgment zone. You have to be able to see things through very different lens and know that this isn't about your personal beliefs. You have to set those aside. You are there representing the organization. And again, within an organization, think of a family picture. No one wants to be left out of the family picture. And so in an organization, everybody wants to see themselves as part of that organizational family. And so you have to have compassion and empathy.
Fantastic. And Anthony, did you want to add anything to that?
I was just going to say patience, perseverance, and persistence.
Wow, the 3 Ps.
You need the 3 Ps. You know, because it is a lot of work, and you do have to know when to be patient, and know when to be persistent, and know when to persevere.
So there was a dramatically different tone of the conversation before May 2020 and after. Anthony, how has the uprising after the murder of George Floyd changed your DE&I work, and how can it be a priority for organizations that have other big issues to deal with, like the pandemic?
Right. So I'll start with the protests following the murder of George Floyd. What that did was it caused organizations to have real conversations about structural or systemic racism, and also to identify those policies and those procedures that were creating obstacles and barriers for people of color, you know, and it was hindering them from being successful in an organization or from elevating in an organization. So I think first and foremost, it caused, I think everybody in this room, when the civil unrest took place, the protests, I'm not going to call it a riot, everybody in here probably had some conversation with someone about why. Why is this happening? And so, you know, in organizations, equity became a priority. You know, racial equity, gender equity, all those things became a priority for organizations. We were talking about the D, and we were talking about the I. We wasn't really talking about that E until after the civil unrest. And so the second part of the question, I think Tanny and Angela have hit on it pretty good, but DEI must be in the organization's DNA. It has to be omnipresent in everything that we do. Our DEI strategies, our plans, our programs must be aligned with our values, our purpose, our vision. It's all got to work together and be ingrained into all areas of the organization. I will say this, and I'll give a plug in for CML. We embrace DEI in our collections. We have to embrace DEI in all aspects of our programming so that it becomes a natural part of our culture and is what we do every day. And it sort of reminds me of what Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast, right? And so we got to look at our culture and make sure that our culture is a powerful culture and it's an empowering culture, and that's what's going to lead us to success.
Fantastic. I'm going to put you on the spot real quick. You had a career before this. Would you share with the audience what that was, just to help them understand your point of view?
Yeah, so I worked in law enforcement for about 28 years and finished as the Assistant Chief of Police for the Westerville Police Department. And so, yeah, career change. But I will say that in my time in law enforcement, meeting with and speaking with and helping with people from various backgrounds and various cultures helped me to see the importance of this work. Because once you learn, to listen to people and learn about people, you build those relationships and those friendships. Guess what? Law enforcement becomes real easy.
Fantastic. So, Jona, you've heard the conversations and you see things that are happening out in the community. And what do you think, as far as this whole topic is concerned, what can organizations do to serve their AAPI employees, customers, and a community as a whole better? What could we be doing better?
Yeah, when I was preparing for this panel, I spoke to several members of our organization, and I think the broad consensus is that AAPI issues are overlooked in these spaces. Like what you mentioned, when we talk about race in these spaces, it's usually black and white. And that is probably due to many different reasons, but one of the root causes of that, I think, is the model minority myth. So the model minority myth is a stereotype of AAPIs as being, successful, law-abiding, hardworking, due to some innate, qualities or, immigrant striving. And, that's what could be called a positive stereotype. But like any stereotype, this stereotype is dehumanizing, right? It keeps us from seeing people as their true selves with, complicated needs and issues. And what it does organizationally is that it obscures the different challenges that your employees or your customers or your community might be facing. So I think everybody needs to be interrogating whether this stereotype comes into play in any of your programs or your strategies, right? So that's probably the first one I wanted to say. The next is do your research, and I'm gonna keep beating the drum on disaggregated data. Rebecca Nelson is here, and Rebecca is a great advocate for disaggregated data for AAPIs, because this is so important. You need to know your employees, your community, and your customers, and not just lump us into one group. Lastly, so next week would be 1 year since the tragic mass shooting in Atlanta, where 6 Asian women were killed. And that week was quickly followed by a shooting in Indianapolis where 4 Sikh people were killed in a FedEx facility. And I just wanted to let you all know that these events are weighing heavy on your AAPI community members, and it all is coming in this midst of an rise in anti-Asian racism and violence, and hopefully you're also aware of that. And something that all organizations could do to address this is to simply do a bystander intervention training. So these trainings will equip everybody to know what to do when they encounter somebody harassing somebody for being Asian American or Pacific Islander. So yeah, so those are a couple of things that I would recommend for organizations to think about.
Fantastic. And one thing, yes, go ahead.
Can I add, I think during this time, we don't have a shortage, unfortunately, of hatred across our country. In the AAPI community, there was police issues before in the LGBTQ community, and certainly after the tragic death of George Floyd in the Black community. And so we have been at Nationwide very intentional, again, and purposeful, you'll hear me say those terms a lot, about simply checking in on one another. It's certainly leaders checking in on their associates, but it's peers and colleagues checking in with people that look different from me, recognizing all that's going through the world, and I forgot, we're also living through a pandemic. And so just checking in and pausing and saying, how are you? And really stop and listening to, how are you? And then let that conversation sort of flow organically, but the learning and the connections that take place from just simply asking, how are you? And genuinely wanting to hear and listen to that response is so critical during these unfortunate and unique times in our history with the heightened hatred for just about everything.
Thank you. Appreciate that. And one thing I was going to add too, when we were speaking about stereotypes, there's also a lot of science and documentation that stereotyping can have a very adverse effect on performance as well. So, you know, bear that in mind too. That keeps us from getting that other intel opportunity if we're stereotyping people. So now we move to the part where I'm just going to throw some questions out and see for any of our panelists that would like to ask. And the first one is, what mistakes do you see organizations making or potentially making with their DE&I efforts?
I'll just throw out, I think, I mentioned it before, but thinking about this as a project and kind of a check the box, this has to be for any size organization. And you know, speaking of our organization, we only have about 50 people at our headquarters, and so we are on the smaller side. So we could say, well, we don't have anyone we can dedicate to DEI, and so you know, I look over to our pseudo DEI, our VP of Community Impact, who also does a lot with our DEI. But just because you're a smaller organization doesn't mean that you can't immerse yourself in this, and this is a part of your fabric, as I think Angela described it. And so I think that a mistake could be that we could check the box, and then that we don't immerse the entire company in it, and then we have metrics. And it's not just about workforce, but it's also about supplier. And Angela also talked about this. It's about community. And for us, even, you know, we have a large body of investment company. Who are we investing with? What are we investing in? So it really goes over the entire company. It's not just focused on our hiring practices, for example.
Yeah, I've heard it said that we want to avoid being performative and be transformative. So thank you, appreciate that. Anyone else want to add in on that?
I'd just say data and humans, right? A lot of organizations fail to look at the data, and they fail to listen to the people that work in the organization. And if you look at the people that work and listen to the people that work in the organization, and you look at the data, you'll probably get a good idea of what you need to do in your organization to build out your DEI strategy.
Sorry, I was going to add one more thing. Sure. We did surveys with our associates, so we really tried to find out where people are. So really trying to get that base case to be empathetic, to really understand where we are, and then asking our associates where do they want to go. And then that involvement of our associates, and you know, Anthony was right, it has to come from the top and the top leadership. But if you don't involve your associates and they don't feel included in it, it's not going to be sustainable. So that's something that we've learned.
I would just add, go ahead, Jona.
Oh, I would add having a limited view of what diversity means. We talk a lot about race and gender, but I think putting in ability, immigration status, and remembering that, you know, intersectionality exists, and we all live in intersections of our identity, and taking that into account.
We like to say it's all the things that you see, but it's the things that you don't see also. I mean, it's even diversity of thought, backgrounds and personalities. It goes far beyond what it typically is the obvious, and that's gender and race. There's differently abled. So yes, I couldn't agree more with that, Jona. And I was just going to add, I think it's making sure that you are critically focused. I think when you are focused with where it is you're wanting to go on your DEI journey, or what those strategic priorities are, you have better clarity around those things you should be saying yes to, and those things that you should perhaps pass on. What I have found too often is, especially when you're just starting on the journey, you're wanting to solve all the problems like today. And remember, I said DEI is absolutely a journey. So figure out what those things are that you want to focus on, and hit those really hard and focus your efforts there.
Fantastic. And we are drawing real close to the time where we want to entertain some questions from you. But before we do that, if we could do a quick lightning kind of response from anyone that wants to jump in. How do organizations sustain the commitment to DE&I? How do we keep this going? Any thoughts on that?
Okay, I'll just jump in. One thing is we put it in our reviews. I mean, it becomes part of everything we do in our organization. So we put it in our hiring practices. We put it in our orientation. We put it in our performance reviews, so that it's part of our everyday life of everything we do.
Fantastic. Any other input on that one?
Yeah, I think because DEI work often relies on people who are already directly impacted, does work on this affect their leadership potential? Like, is that counted towards whether they're picked for leadership roles? Is it in their performance reviews? I think that's very important. And also, are the programs well funded? Are different groups having to compete for funding? I mean, that will be bad for morale if some groups feel like they're prioritized and other groups are not.
Fantastic. Well, guess what? It's time for your questions. So, Doug, do we have some questions from the audience or from the online audience?
We have many, Ralph. Thank you very much. Thank you. So please join me here at the microphone if you have questions. I'm sure there are many people who have things on their mind they want to ask. We'll alternate live audience questions with questions submitted in advance and then from our live stream audience. So our first question, this one was submitted in advance. Katie Limler with KLH Engineers. Katie asks, most of the wonderful books, podcasts, etc., about DEI strategies for companies are geared to large corporations with thousands of employees. They're not easy to scale down. Can you give suggestions about implementing DEI strategies for smaller companies, say with about 100 people?
So the question is, how can we scale this for smaller organizations, because it seems that most of the materials that are out there are for really large organizations. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I would start out with identifying people in the organization that have passion for the space and building out a task force to start to look at areas that you can work on in the organization. That would be a start, because a lot of times small organizations can't afford to bring in a consultant to start to work for them. But just bringing the staff together and trying to identify some goals, some objectives that they can focus on, and then start to build out a strategy.
Yeah, one other thing I'd like to add as far as responding to that question is concerned, I would encourage any organization that may feel like we're not big enough to do this to reach out, because we all talk all the time. I mean, we are always having conversations. We had so many Zoom calls and coffee and things like that, and we're always looking for ways, because if we don't have this cascade throughout the community, then we're not going to be able to execute fully on our end.
Hi, my name is Tony Bell, and I'm with Phoenix Consulting Company. I'm a social scientist, and we study the data in order to develop curriculum for DE&I and learning all the time. My question was sparked by Dr. Wilson's comment about DEI and B being lonely work. What would you say for champions who are working in isolation? And my definition of that is you have someone with the title of DE&I officer, director, what have you, and there's the lip service, but they don't have a budget to support them, and they also don't have the full support of the organization. And the question certainly is for each of you, but what encouragement do you have to support those champions in isolation?
Champions in Isolation panel. Thanks, Tony.
Ralph. No, Ralph said it though. I mean, it's finding that network out there that's in the space that you can communicate with, and trying to figure out, are there other ways that you can accomplish some of the DEI work if you don't have those internal resources? Are there any external resources out there that you can bring into the organization? But building your network is key, I believe, in this space.
And I would just add to that, I think building that network is critical, and then also staying the course, sort of being relentless in this work. So often I think when and that's why Ralph said we stay in close contact, because at each organization there's typically one CDO and a small group that supports that CDO. So it's very important that you build that network and lift each other up and have that outlet to go to talk about similar challenges and obstacles that are going on in your organization that are likely the same challenges and issues and concerns going on in other organizations. So really being intentional about building that network. And I'm sure those of us on the stage could help build that network if you'd like.
Absolutely. We're all friends, seriously. We talk, we're friends, we have each other's phone numbers, we call, and we talk about this all the time. So thank you. Doug, I think you have another question from the audience.
I do, Ralph, thank you. Jerron Terry with Jerron Terry Communications says, you may be aware that Ohio's legislature is seeking to create laws that are very harmful to transgender children, their families, and their health care providers. As business leaders, aside from supporting Equality Ohio's efforts to get the Equality Act passed by signing on to Ohio Business Competes, what can you do to make sure your company's DE&I values are reflected in Ohio's legislation?
Okay, that's a great question. And I know we have people that are ready to answer it. So if anyone would like to jump in on that.
I will just say from a nationwide perspective, we work very closely with our Office of Government Relations, and they know our DE&I strategy, beliefs, and unwavering commitment and focus. And so we also leverage lobbyists to support the things that we believe are right and should be supported.
Any other input on that? I want to share this. A corporate leader who I know and have a tremendous amount of respect for once said, you know, as people in the corporate community, we can influence change more so than anyone else because we have captive audience. So we all have ways to influence and to make a difference, and we appreciate that question. Looks like Steve Miller is up for a question.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steve Miller. I'm the Area Director for United Negro College Fund. We raised over $2 million in Ohio and over $500,000 here in Central Ohio. I'm here to ask our panel and want our audience to consider the value of historically black college students as they are potential workforce diversity candidates for developing more opportunities in corporate Columbus.
Panel, do you have any immediate responses to that or considerations?
Was the question of how to employ them, or say?
Well, I think part of the opportunity that we're discussing is diversity and inclusion, and you can't have inclusion without talent. And historically black colleges have been a bastion for talent for many, many years, and I just want to make sure that everyone knows that UNCF scholarships students that go to historically black colleges, but also PWIs, predominantly white institutions, students can go to any school that they want, but historically black colleges are kind of an untapped market for talent for all of our local and national organizations.
Steve, I will say that we've seen the value that HBCUs bring from a talent perspective for many years. At Nationwide, we have partnered with HBCUs for over 30 years. So I echo what you're saying. It is a great talent source, and would encourage anyone who's not partnering with HBCUs to partner with HBCUs. We got a couple right here in Ohio. That's right.
Yeah, I'll add to that if you don't mind, because I know Nationwide does this as well, but at Encova, we just started a partnership with Central State. The two HBCUs here in Ohio are Central State and Wilberforce. And if you're ever headed to Southwest Ohio or the Dayton area, I've got great news for you. They're right across the street from each other, so you could see both in the same day, and there's great talent there. Tanny?
I think it's an exciting opportunity because there's a war on talent. And as we look for diverse pools, we have to do a better job of increasing the diversity of our pipeline. And that's just an amazing source for us. And I know that's something that we're looking at. And I think that we'll see much more interest and excitement in that area. Fantastic.
Doug, did we have another question?
We do, Ralph. Christina Joy, and this question comes from Christina's watching on our live stream audience. We've kind of touched on this before, but maybe there might be more, additional points to bring up. What advice do you have for a nonprofit organization that doesn't know exactly where to start?
Fantastic. So where do nonprofits start? What advice do we have for them? Any thoughts on that?
I could start with something. Build relationships with community organizations around you, and talk to many people. Just build those relationships. And there's a lot of resources out there that are free and available, and there's a lot of people passionate in your community to help your organization do this type of work.
I was just going to say the same thing I said the last question. You got to build your network. You got to reach out to people that have similar organizations that are doing the work and find out where they got started at. But I will say this. Each organization is different, and each organization has its own unique challenges when it comes to the space. So what's working for one organization may not necessarily work for the next organization. So you really got to do the work to really identify where your challenges are, and then how to build that strategy to address some of those challenges.
Yeah, I would just add that I've had several nonprofits contact me, and so we've shared all the information we had from consultants, a toolkit. But as Anthony said, it's a toolkit, but it has to be designed for that very specific organization. But again, it's just a reiteration that there are a lot of people available to help, and especially with nonprofits. I do know the consultant we worked with also had lower rates for nonprofits to make that make that resource available.
Did you want to put a name out there?
Well, Marlon Moore is an awesome consultant, but I don't want to, I want to speak for him. But I've known that he's worked with nonprofits, and again, just does great work.
I also wanted to add, places like OSU offer a lot of training for free that's available. Actually, tonight there is a panel on AAPI Women Equal Pay Day that several members of OPAWL will be at. So that's through OSU. Just look it up, or I could look it up later and give you the information. But it's going to be a great panel discussion. So there's those kinds of resources as well.
Sure, and I'll add too. Again, reach out, find us on LinkedIn, and we can connect you. And I know personally, I also wear a community hat at Encova, and leverage your board, leverage your companies that you're connected with. They always have extra seats where they can bring folks in, and you can get some extra programming. And I know I've actually done some board training and worked on some task forces with some different nonprofits. So reach out to us and see if there might be a chance for us to help. Looks like Pat's next. Hey, Pat.
Hey, Ralph. How are you doing?
Doing great.
Great job for the panel. So I have a question, actually a sentence of information for the audience. I'm Pat Lisinski, CEO of the Columbus Metropolitan Library. A sentence of information for our audience about House Bill 327, which is legislation that seeks to prohibit schools, universities, political subdivisions, and state agencies from teaching, promoting, and offering instruction or training on certain divisive topics. This is defined as one of the divisive topics. It also would affect libraries' ability to have programming and to buy materials in this space and to have training for our people in this space. My question to you is, thinking about how devastating this would be to schools, universities, state agencies, public libraries, it's bad for business. How excited would Intel and Google and Amazon and Facebook be about this being a part of our legislation? How do we marshal the forces of our business community to fight this, because it's bad for business?
Thank you. Did we have any responses?
One comment. 2 years ago, again after the George Floyd murder, there was a public letter. It was that racism is a public health issue, and hundreds of CEOs signed on to that. And I think this is the same thing. Hundreds of all of us need to lean in on this and sign letters and use lobbyists and go to our legislature. But it does take all of us stacking hands, because as Ralph said earlier, we can make a difference. And I appreciate, Pat, that you're standing up and saying that, because it builds awareness. Because these things can just sneak in, and we have to build awareness, and we all have to publicly talk about it in order to make change. So thank you, Pat.
I wanted to highlight the work of Honesty for Ohio Education. So that's a coalition of organizations in Ohio fighting these kinds of bills. So just go to their website. I think it's h4oe.org. And they are looking specifically for chief diversity officers to introduce to the work that's already happening. And yeah, would love to be in contact with y'all after this about that.
Fantastic. So we have time for one more question. So here it goes.
Thank you. Good evening, afternoon. My name is Raphael Davis Williams. I am the Director of Equity and Inclusion for the ACLU of Ohio. And I am, one quick comment. Ralph, you mentioned it a moment ago, and someone asked about nonprofits. We started with our board, and that is exactly where we sought to create space on our board for more to have more diversity there. There are a lot of acronyms that we hear, DEI and all these different, JEDI and all these different acronyms. At the ACLU, we use equity, diversity, inclusion, and belonging. And belonging is really where we focus. We put our focus on all of those others are important. And I'd love to hear from the panel a bit more about it. Tanny, you touched on it in your very first answer about what it means to have individuals, once you've done the work to get these individuals there, how you go about making sure that they feel like they are a part of your organization so that they then stay with your organization and then become, as Angela put it, a lifer at the organization. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. And I will say for us, it's critically important that all of our associates, again, see themselves and feel like they belong at Nationwide. And so we leverage tremendously in this space our 16 associate resource groups, or ERGs, we call our associates, so they're ARGs, and our business unit councils to continue to elevate that inclusive culture for us. And again, I think that that's important. We are very small, and most organizations that have DEI offices, it's a small team. So at Nationwide, there's 4 on my team in addition to myself. And we can't do all this work ourselves. And so we have to leverage the associate resource groups and business unit councils, which are an extension of our office, to help do this critical work. And so that everyone, to the point of the question, feels like they belong. And it's, again, it's a continuum. It's nothing that we stop. We continue on, and I want to also mention that it's important that you celebrate those different things. So our ARGs and associate resource groups and business unit councils are part of celebrating the various heritage months. This month is Women's History Month, and so we're doing lots of programming around Women's History Month, but that is another way that people feel and see and realize the belonging and understand how important each one of them are. Each one of us are unique and special in our own rights, and so who doesn't want to feel like, again, they're not a part of a family?
Just that's eloquently said, Angela, everything you said. I'll just add mentoring and sponsorship. So something that we're really leaning into and exploring at Crane is that sense of, do you feel like that you belong or that someone cares about you, whether you're a young woman, black, if you're AAPI, is that there's someone in the organization that you know is your advocate and that you can turn to. They may look like you, they may not look like you, but it's important that you've got someone that is always there sponsoring you, advocating for your development.
Fantastic. So I promised you at the beginning of the program that this was going to go by very fast, and it did. So thank you again to our panel. I think you all are going to stay put, and I'm going to get out of the way so Kelly can come back out and close the program.
Okay, I hope that you all found today's program as insightful as I did, and I know that you probably all have a long list of action items that you want to take back, but I want to just add a couple more. So one, you heard a lot about networking and how important it is to have relationships and build relationships, and really when it comes down to it, DEI is all about people and data, but people. It's about people. So I encourage you, look around the room, and this is a great audience. We want you to come back. So next week, we are going to be here Wednesday, March 16th. We're presenting discussing Central Ohio's role in cell and gene therapy. We have a ton of great topics. You can see some of them, just the upcoming ones in your forum flyer, so check those out or sign up for the email list if you're not on that too, because we are also, Friday, March 18th, going to have special breaking news forum here at the Boathouse focusing on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Join us for both of these for really in-depth forums, and I want to then, of course, get back to all the thank yous. So thank you to today's sponsors, Cover My Meds, Barnes & Thornburg, Encova Insurance, and Crane Group, and thank you for the support from WBNS 10 TV. Thank you to our online virtual seat patrons and to the Emergency Response Fund of the Columbus Foundation for presenting our live stream in partnership with the Columbus Dispatch. And special appreciation to today's speakers, Angela Bretz, Tanny Crane, Jona Hilario, Anthony Wilson, and our host, Ralph Smithers Jr. And finally, thank all of you for joining us. We really could not do this without you. We look forward to seeing you next week as the Columbus Metropolitan Club presents another community conversation. Thanks and have a wonderful day.